you're back here with the Looking Glass Forum. We're working hard to illuminate your minds and bring the truth of the understanding of history and science and philosophy. And thank you for coming back again.
So we're back here again at the Looking Glass Forum, and I appreciate you guys returning again to listen to these episodes and to take in these different kinds of aspects of history that you will never hear. And I enjoy finding these new dimensions within the historical subject matter. So I would like to have feedback. I enjoy the criticism. I like to have kind of an understanding of what people are hearing when they're listening to these episodes. And what I am attempting to do is to try to properly place America, our new kind of fresh civilization, in the scope of world history. And we can go back pretty far and see that we're rising as a people out of the ashes and the wars and the barbarity and the chaos of the distant past. And this question of the distant past and the origins of man is a continuous question. It's a continuous question that people have asked in different scientific disciplines to discuss where is man coming from. Anthropologically, archaeologically, they've even found Ur of the Chaldees, a very ancient city in Mesopotamia that would lead to the rise of Babylonia. And so we have to ask ourselves, how did we enter into the fossil record of history? And of course, it really comes down to a lack of knowledge. People don't fully understand or comprehend, even with our great, marvelous intellect. We cannot recompile the sands of time in order to tell us or to give us a clue as to where we might find our origins. Some people believe that we were just protoplasm and evolutionary junk. We're just amoebas that crawled out of the ocean and grew hair, became monkeys, and became men. And that's a really easy and less interesting treatment of the facts. We have to find a way to arrive here in the world in the natural order of things. We have to discover a way to understand ourselves. We can look back in the distant past, the Cambrian period, for instance. We can go back millions of years in a geological record. We can see that the isotope's half-life is only 60,000 years, and we can kind of determine that a lot of tectonic shifts and a lot of activity within the Earth's crust has been constant. There's no doubt about it. You can look over the Grand Canyon, you can look over different areas of geology and see that there's been a vast history unfolding here on Earth long before mankind comes into the fossil record. And also, it's equally as compelling to try to explain how there are living organisms in the first place. So it could be understood that there's matter in the universe and that matter could ignite and create stars, and that those ignitions of matter could explode and create tiny chunks of rock and other matter. And this is inert, lifeless minerals, different particles that make up the atomic chart, the elements. And so that's where we're at with our knowledge. Beyond that, how amoebas could come into existence, develop complex information cells like RNA and DNA, actually have functions of processing light into energy and absorbing raw matter and for fuel, and then having the reproductive mechanisms within themselves to replicate over and over and over again and reproduce and have sex with a male and female counterpart. I mean, they want to start out with single cell amoebas that are asexual, and then they split apart and they have male and female sexual components. But how did that become a vast array of moss? I have Spanish moss still stuck in my door when I closed the door this morning in my car. So it's hanging there. It makes me think, how did we get Spanish moss? And the little piece of the leaf that's stuck with the branch that's with it. How did we get a leaf? How did we get Spanish moss intergrowing with leaves? The little frogs that live in there, the birds that sweep down and they fly. They fly around. These creatures fly around. Not just birds, but pterodactyls flew, and flying squirrels fly, and flying insects fly, and all manner of flying fish fly. How did these mechanisms of evolution develop without any kind of consciousness or intelligence all these traits that would allow them to fly. So we can see that nature adapts. The owl flies and turns brown in the summer and turns white in the winter. The foliage changes. You have other animals, species that do the same thing. They don't change, but polar bears are white and grizzly bears are not. So we can see that even more astonishing, within the cell and then the genetic activity and the mechanisms, the species have the ability to adapt slightly to their environment. And so it's a very interesting puzzle. Evolutionary proponents, Darwin's evolutionary theory, are going to say that, well, hey, if they can adapt a little bit over time, then perhaps these species could change entirely from a reptile dinosaur species to, like a pterodactyl, into like a flying feathered species like the bird. Just tiny changes, tiny adaptations over time, millions and millions of years. And so this is the prevailing theory, that somehow the universe can manufacture life all by itself, just given these different elements and given enough time. You don't need a god anymore. You don't need any kind of creative force. We're just out here spinning wildly on planet Earth for millions of years without any conscious life, and just by accident the universe tips off life in this grand scale. Plants, animals, fish, all different variety of innumerable. And then it really hasn't really gotten to a full scientific understanding of bacteria, parasites that live inside the guts of animals. So there's a wide complexity, myriad life forms. And it gets even more remarkable when we go into the fossil record and we look at eons past, all the different life forms that have never survived. And we arrive at this point where all the prehistoric life forms are gone, and we have this select set of animals living on the earth. And then suddenly in the fossil record arrives man. So this is an incredible mystery that we have to really have more respect for. And in the attempt to try to grasp our origins and to take control of our own reality and to have a claim on our own life, our own soul, if we were created by a higher power, then we don't have ownership of our own soul and our own reality. We're just simply the property of another. So it's an attempt to take back our own minds and our own destiny, to say, hey, we're our own thing. We don't have to try to comprehend an original cause to all of this effect. We don't need to find out who it is we owe our lives and our natural existence to. We just simply have to take this life and it's ours to do what we want with it. There's the difference in the attitude. If everything is evolved and comes from nothing, then nothing means anything. There is no great justice in the universe at the end of time. There's no reckoning. There's no great grand scales. There's no great judgment. Just nothing. It's nihilism. So
every class of ideology and belief system in the world will gravitate towards nihilism because it fits their presupposition and their paradigm that stipulates that there is no divine creator, there's no grand scale of creation, there's no actual meaning behind all the phenomenon of nature. And so they'll presuppose that all the meaning that we take and our perception of complexity from design is only illusory, and so creates a delusion that somehow this place has some kind of marvelous, meaningful background drama that's taking place. And this was something that was always believed, even by ancient man. The Greeks, ancient civilizations believed that there were the gods, that there must be some supernatural power, some incredibly phenomenalistic forces of deliberate and miraculous energy that's compulsing the universe and turning all the spheres, all the galaxies and all the planetary bodies must have some kind of grand meaning. And so as we're kind of moving through this philosophical dilemma, we have to wonder, what is the meaning? And if there is no meaning, and we're just functioning on a biological level, then there must be no justice in the universe. So if the gazelle in the Serengeti is taken by the lion, and if that's all we are, just biological functions, and the strong kill and take from the weak, and there's no moral absoluteness to the universe, then we have no reason to be civilized. We have no reason to tell the truth. We have no reason to believe that there's a deity who issued 10 commandments for our good, that if we follow them, we'll have a more complete and peaceful and productive life, and more happy life if we follow the plan of the Creator. So those who believe in nihilism will deny that there's any such grand plan or there's any real meaning. So for them, every kind of reprobate behavior, every kind of perverse sexual indiscretion, every kind of crime is really just nothing moral. It's really just an act of one animal, like a bear attacking a lion or a lion eating a gazelle, or it's just a function of nature and has really no real underlying spiritual consequences. So in other words, we who are religious like to think that when Hitler dies, he'll go to face his judgment and consequences of his actions in life will be levied on him. And those who believe in nihilism and Darwinian evolution believe that there is no cosmic grand judgment, and Hitler just goes into the darkness, into the silence of the sleep of death, and he just disappears from existence, and he has nothing more, he has nothingness, just like all the victims of the Holocaust. They were just, they died and became nothing into the shadow of death, and there's no grand accounting for all that evil. And there is, and since there is no God, there is no evil or good. It's just Hitler was the strong man, he was the lion, and all the victims in Auschwitz were just the gazelles, and they just were the victims, and this is just the way of life. And so you can see that those who believe in this nihilistic evolutionary process or the meaninglessness of life have no qualms about taking absolute power, because ultimately that's all there is in their point of view. So let's go a little more deeper into this kind of complex discussion and hear this interesting audio clip that we have here. This is kind of an introductory theme to the whole idea that we're discussing, and it's going to be Ben Stein on Hanvey and Combs. And then I think it's an older clip, obviously, but it's an interesting breakdown of the film that Ben Stein did called Expelled, and it just takes a look at the kind of growing move towards what people call creationism, or the design hypothesis that brings into our attention the notion that the living cells within living organisms are organs and our tissues, and the complexity of living biology itself in plant forms and the creatures in the ocean, that it represents a biocomplexity and a physiological complexity that's so sophisticated and interlocked. Systems are so completely molecularly interlocked that they can't possibly have arisen from evolutionary dynamics. In other words, there's no way for one system to build upon the other without the entire and complete working order of the systems that they're built on. So they couldn't evolve out of one another. All right, so let's listen to this clip here. This is Ben Stein.
So we're talking about a gradual descent down the level of intelligibility until we reach evolutionary biology. We don't even know what a species is, for heaven's sakes.
So his theory is smoke, but elegant smoke.
There's a certain elegance to it, but I think Einstein had the appropriate remark. He preferred to leave elegance to his tailor.
That was a clip from Ben Stein's new documentary, Expelled, No Intelligence Allowed. The film offers an in-depth look at science in the 21st century, specifically the scientific community's obsession with evolution, and the great lengths it will go to discredit intelligent design or the religious view of creation. Here to talk about the film is actor and author, among other things. Very unique career you've had, Ben. Your first appearance, finally.
I've been waiting for years.
Well, we were happy to have you. We've been waiting for you for years.
I'm happy now.
This is it. This is the pinnacle. After all, you've done Ferris Bueller.
I'm retiring now. I've been on
Ben Stein's Money, Ferris Bueller, but this is it.
This is it.
All right. In this movie,
yes,
you go to a concentration camp where Mengele.
We went to Dachau, not to Auschwitz.
Okay. And you talk about Hitler being influenced by Darwinism.
No doubt about it.
Why invoke Hitler? What are you trying to say?
Well, our point is that Darwin, this meek, mild-mannered sage of a country estate outside London, had ideas which, when implemented, led to the Holocaust. He believed there were superior and inferior races. He believed that only fools would allow the inferior races to continue breeding. His followers and close friends in the United Kingdom said that meant we should start exterminating the Jews.
But are you implying that if you believe in evolution and Darwinism, that there's a link to the way Hitler thinks?
Not today's Darwinists. No, not at all today's Darwinists. I mean, the leading Darwinists today, like Dawkins and Dennett, those people aren't even remotely in that league. But Darwinism gave the rationale for the Holocaust. There had always been anti-Semitism. There had always been racism. But to apply the idea of exterminating whole races as a good good thing, as a thing that was salutary for the human race, that came out of Darwinism, and it's a frightening thing.
Yeah, but it's not what Darwinists or people who believe in evolution think. That's no way that any of us who may believe that are close or anywhere near that.
I couldn't agree more. I didn't imply. By bringing up Hitler, bringing up concentration camps in the film, aren't you? You just implied it, Alan.
But that's what you do in the film. You bring up Hitler.
No, we brought it up about Darwin, not about you. Not about you
or those who believe in evolution.
No, you're just making that up. You just made that up. That's just not true at all.
Why bring up Hitler?
Because Hitler was a lineal descendant of Darwin. He wasn't a lineal descendant of Alan Colmes. I don't think you were even alive.
I understand, but the implication is there. Well,
the implication is just an implication you made up.
All right, well, that's what the implication I got watching your movie. Could there be a scientific explanation to the creation of the world?
I don't think that. Here's my point, or at least the point we make in the movie. There's no evidence whatsoever that Darwin had anything useful to say, or anything to say, period, about how life began, or how the universe began, or how gravity began, or how physics began, or fluid motion, or thermodynamics began. He had nothing to say about that whatsoever. So why attribute that to Darwinist causes? Why not say it's just as likely that there was an intelligent designer who did that? I mean, there's no reason to believe that there wasn't an intelligent designer who did it.
And welcome to the show. Good to see you.
Thank you.
One of the things you are exposing in this movie is that educators, scientists, they're ridiculed, denied tenure, fired, because they believe that there is evidence of design.
Yes, all you have to do is say, look, how do the planets stay in their orbits? How can a cell have 1 million or close to 1 million moving parts, all of which fit together perfectly without there being intelligent design? All you have to do is ask the question, and you get fired. Not always, but often enough.
Look, I've had many debates with a lot of friends of mine over the issue of creation. Late at night, nothing better to do. We talk about it, but it's important to me because I do believe that there is a creator. I believe there's a God. I don't know how one could look at the majesty and the sophistication and the intricacy of universes within universes and the sun and the stars and gravity and all the beauty and majesty of creation and not conclude there's a God.
I don't know how either. I mean, Mr. Dawkins, this great atheist and Darwinist, said, well, God has kept his existence hidden. He says that in our movie. But it's not hidden. All you have to do is look at the Grand Canyon. All you have to do is look at Lake Ponderay in North Idaho. All you have to do is look at a sunset on the island of Manhattan or a sunset in Malibu, and you see the evidence of God all over.
But to be an atheist, don't you have to believe that something comes from nothing?
You have to believe that the universe originated in nothing and is rushing towards nowhere, and that just doesn't make any more sense. Let me just say, now people say to me all the time, but you have no scientific evidence for intelligent design. And it's true. We don't have a signature of an intelligent designer, except for the complexity itself is the signature.
That it all could have, first of all, that it could have existed on its own, exploded in a massive explosion, and then with all the intricacy and sophistication of it all.
I mean, the chance of it are minuscule. We have mathematicians who say the chance is nil.
So there we have it. We're just going to have that little clip to lay into the discussion itself. And it really goes into all the different facets of academic research and scientific discipline and all the different areas of study. I mean, it really ultimately becomes a philosophical discussion about what came first and how there could be a cause like the universe, and with all the complexity of the elements and all the different laws of thermodynamics and all the different complexity within the universe, how that could arise on its own without an outside cause, without an original impetus to set all that into motion and actually invent and bring into being the complexity of the inner materials themselves, like the rocks, all the debris that you see in the solar system around the planets, the debris that makes up the moon, the rocks themselves, how that matter could actually come into existence and actually be there floating around where we could observe it without an original cause. So that's how we kind of begin our look into this really important discussion, because it tells you more about yourself than it does about the universe, how you look at this. So if you believe that there is no God and there is no meaning, and that all the rocks and all the blazing energy of the stars and all the complexity of the elemental record and then biological life here on Earth, if you could somehow look at that, all that grand intricacy, and
think that it just popped into being on layer upon layer of physical dynamics like gravity, even looking at the water on Earth itself. It's hard for me personally, to believe that those phenomenal dynamics and superstructures could actually exist in reality in an expanding universe that looks like it had a starting point in the Big Bang. So all those dynamics taken in totality, there's no way for that to occur unless it was set into motion. And the problem that the atheists and the nihilists have is that they can't possibly comprehend an intelligence, omnipotent deity, a singular power within the universe that's so intelligent and so omniscient and absolutely powerful that he could have the essential time in eternity and the position within the background of reality that the universe is expanding into, to have so much complete influence over our lives and over existence that this God or this deity could create and influence and direct the sophistication of the universe. It's just for them they can see the universe, but they cannot come to grips with the magnitude of the reality of God that would have the position, the power, and the intellect, and the actual phenomenal capability to invent and bring into being a universe. So it's easier for them just to imagine that it popped into existence from nothing. So it comes down to the very crucible of human intellect and understanding. And it really brings into view ourselves in this whole equation. And the microscopic and the macroscopic scope of all that's happening, we are here in existence in a very peculiar way, having come into the fossil record in a very peculiar way. So you have Earth's fossil record just laying out, and then suddenly there is just human beings. And many different religious organizations and scientists and different proponents of Darwinism and evolution and nihilism have worked very hard, even created false evidence, it turns out, to support the idea that there was a Cro-Magnon man or a caveman or some kind of link species that linked humanity to like an ape ancestor that we evolved upward through no act of God, just through the preponderance and the explosion of the universe and the sun blazing and the stars aligning. Somehow a snail became a possum, and the possum became an ape, and an ape became a man over billions and trillions of years. So this question of understanding our own nature really comes into view. And in my perspective, a man enters into the fossil record fully formed, and you go right from the point where man falls from the Garden of Eden, the fall of man, and Adam and Eve end up face planting into the wilderness of the world and having children. From that point on, you're going to have the entrance of the civilization, the entrance of human civilization. 10,000 years ago, you're going to have the Ur of the Chaldees, you're going to have the different tribes of man expanding across the face of the earth. You're going to go right to the Bronze Age, and history is going to unfold instantaneously within the last 10,000 years. But before that, there was no man in the world, as it were. So that's what it comes down to. It comes down to an ability to understand what's at play and to view nature itself as an effect or an outcome or a secondary event with a primary cause, or nature itself is just a continuance of banality of nothingness. So the universe is really just a cytoplasm or a great blob of matter in a cosmos that is ultimately going to die out, and ultimately the universe will come to nothing but just be an expanse, a void of open time-space that has no actual deliberate intention. And so ultimately our lives mean nothing. We're just fruit flies with a 24-hour life cycle, and we come in and out of existence without any meaning at all. And ultimately, you just have to please yourself. Ultimately, you're just an animal who has to feed your appetites. And that's why we see that Darwinian theory was used to justify Hitler's very cynical and vile move towards the liquidation of people who thought were inferior. And not only did Hitler have a book of Darwin's book that he was very influential to him, but he also had a book by Helena Blavatsky, and Helena Blavatsky's works were
something that will come into discussion later on. We'll discuss in greater detail. I think her book was called The Secret Doctrine by Helena Blavatsky. She was a well-known medium or fortune teller at that period. She may even have met Hitler because she was in vogue. She was kind of a popular figure to have seances with. And she had a whole theory about root races and the inferior races. And I think that comes into discussion too about his views of what he viewed as, human beings who were really just lesser evolved animals, and they weren't really connected with the super race or the, higher evolved beings. And that comes into discussion too, because evolution seems to take God out of the equation, take morality and justice and mercy, and take them all off the table, and it just leaves a will to power in a meaningless, nothing universe where nothing matters except for, in this case, Hitler's will to just, clean the species of anything he thought were mongrel races. And since there is no God, and since he was evolved at the highest pinnacle of human intelligence, it was his right to make these decisions to eliminate other whole civilizations. And that's kind of what you're left with when you have no morality, no moral center, no actual understanding of the nature of God's intention for the universe, and therefore you're just left in the void of your own understanding to try to sort, a meaningless universe out on its own. So the most discussed and depraved actions could be thought of as meritorious or heroic. And that's kind of what you're getting with the evolution theory too. You're getting the evolutionary guys out there who think that it's their job to save the world from the human virus. So you can see this whole thing, this whole nihilism and atheism and godlessness is setting itself up again for men who think that they have it within their minds to know what's right, to save the world, and they can, in their short lifespans, can calculate the measurements and the temperatures of the earth and the need for the world to have more or less Arctic ice, and all this is just a depraved thrashing against death because they're trying to save the species, and they can't even admit that the species and the universe and the world itself was brought into being by a higher being than them. So they've taken it upon themselves to become God and to try to make judgments, to rule the world, to save the environment. It's just absurd because they're nihilists. They don't believe in anything. They don't believe that anything matters. So how, and in some extent, it's just a Hitlerian urge to control the environment. Your backyard, your field where you plant your crops is now suddenly in the environment, and the globalists have taken everything. Since they're the protectors of the environment, they've taken the hubris and taken it upon themselves to have the role of the arbiter of all space across the world here, and to protect it from people who are farming and living and trying to prosper. And it's really ultimately a way to crop back and get towards global population control. We're looking at the globalist use of scientific information and their position within academia as the premier echelon of world knowledge and scientific understanding, and the scientific community. I have my fingers up in quotation marks. They're presupposing that they have the only logical analysis, the only sane conclusion to draw from is their religious devotion to their presupposition. So Darwinian theory relies on this idea that all species must have converged from this central root of some amoeba, some organism, some plankton long ago, and sprouted off in all these different directions, and all these different life orbs evolved out of this one kind of tiny single-celled organism. And we know that is just impossible at this point when we look at microbiology. So we're going to look at this discussion that took place between Eric Metaxas and Stephen Meyer, Dr. Stephen Meyer, and this is at a forum called Socrates in the City, and they discuss in depth the different kind of permutations that this conversation takes. And there's no doubt that life forms have been adapting on planet Earth for a very long time, and we'll get into that kind of conversation about how that went, and to understand that creationists who hold to this idea that the whole episode of dinosaurs and Jurassic, Cretaceous eras and all these different kind of eras within our fossil record had taken place within the last 10,000 years are just not really reasonable or rational ideas, but that the idea that the whole event of life on Earth itself has been something that's been sprawling over many millennia and has taken on many different forms, and life has taken many different forms in that time, and that mankind finds itself within that fossil record within the last 10 to 50,000 years of history, and rising up from that point to become the apex species, if you will. So let's listen to this conversation with Stephen Meyer, Dr. Stephen Meyer.
But a question of how long the time scale is involved in the change that has occurred.
But the basic idea, just so everybody's tracking, the basic idea of change over time, that life forms have changed over the millennia, eons, is not generally disputed.
Not generally disputed.
And that intelligent design...
We're certainly not disputing
and every kind of evolution would say that happened.
Right, exactly. Okay. Second meaning of evolution is the idea of common ancestry. And that can refer to universal common ancestry, the idea that all organisms are connected by what Darwin called descent from modification, from this one simple primordial form way back when. Or it could be a more limited thesis that certain groups of organisms are related by common ancestry. But the Darwinian idea was that the history of life is best represented as a kind of tree of life. And he actually drew a tree in the origin to depict this, where the branches at the top of the tree represent all the forms of life that exist today. The trunk or the root of that tree represents that first primordial form, and the ones that only made it halfway up are the ones that got extinct. So it's a visual depiction of his idea about the history of life. And intelligent design is not challenging that either, although there are advocates of intelligent design who are skeptical about that.
Right.
And in fact, there are other scientists who are not.
So you'd consider even common descent to be a theory, not necessarily...
It's definitely a theory.
It's a theory.
It's an attempt to interpret certain facts that we have left behind, and certainly no one saw that whole history. So it's a reconstruction based on the facts that are left behind, and it's one of many possible reconstructions. But it's not what intelligent design is challenging either. The intelligent design is challenging the third meaning of evolution, and that's the idea that there is an unguided, undirected process known as natural selection acting on random mutations that has produced all the forms of life we see, but also has produced the appearance of design that all biologists acknowledge, or nearly all biologists acknowledge. Richard Dawkins, the world's foremost spokesman for so-called neo-Darwinism, the modern textbook version of Darwin's theory, says that life is, that biology, rather, is the study of complicated things that give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose.
How clever of them.
It is the counterintuitive nature of the Darwinian idea that things look, yes, they look designed, whether it's that beautiful structure of the coiled nautilus, or those intricate molecular machines, or the chambered structure of the heart with all its plumbing and wiring. Many things in biology look as though they were designed, but the idea is that they were produced by an undirected, unguided process that produced the appearance of design. So they would say natural selection has the power to mimic. Natural selection mimics the powers of a designing intelligence, but it is not designed or guided in any way. Thus, the leading proponents of Darwinism will say that we have design without a designer. We have the appearance of design.
Is that what it's called? Blind Darwinism?
Well, sometimes it's called the blind watchmaker hypothesis, after the title of one of Dawkins' famous books. And so intelligent design is challenging that, and the title, or the term intelligent design, was selected intelligently, if you will, to make clear which of those three meanings of evolution we're challenging explicitly. We think that there are certain features of biological systems that were actually designed, and you can tell by examining the scientific evidence.
Okay, so just so that everyone's tracking with you, and so that I'm tracking with you, I'm going to repeat back to you what you just said.
Sure.
But not tonight. Because I think that in the popular culture, these distinctions are never clearly made. You would get the idea that there are two theories. One theory is that we were created 11,000 years ago, and Shazam, here we are. The other theory is the scientific theory that says everything happened by random forces, and that we evolved out of primordial soup, and here we are, and there is absolutely no God involved in that process. But what you're saying now, and obviously what I've read about, is that there are so many variations between those two poles. And so intelligent design, as I understand it, is says that, yes, this happened. There were trilobites 4 billion years ago, and things have, quote-unquote, evolved. Things have changed. Maybe I don't want to use the word evolved because it's a little bit loaded, but things have, in fact, changed. We can see this. We can observe this in the fossil record, basically. But blind Darwinists, neo-Darwinists, would say there is no way that could have been directed. There was no God involved in that process. They say that adamantly.
No designer or intelligent agent of any kind.
No agent. It was just utterly random, and it was something that...
Eric, I prefer the term undirected or mindless. Okay, because, and
why?
Well, because you could have something that's random, that appears to be random to us, that actually has a hidden hand behind it. And the Darwinians insist that the appearance of design is an illusion. Now, if it's an illusion, it follows logically that the process that produced the appearance of design was not mindful. It was unguided and undirected. And so that's the crucial tenet. And this idea is actually hard baked into the logic of Darwinism. When you go to the 3rd chapter of The Origin of Species, Darwin uses an interesting analogy to artificial breeding experiments that ranchers and farmers have been doing from time immemorial, where a farmer or rancher could choose a particular trait that he wanted to see maximized or enhanced. You might think of sheep in the far north of Scotland, and if you want to get a woollier breed of sheep, you would select the woolliest males and the woolliest females to breed. And Darwin would. And then generation after generation, you'd get woollier and woollier sheep. This is a well-known phenomenon. 19th century biologists knew all about this. Darwin came along and said, well, what if you had a series of very cold winters, such that all but the woolliest died out? Wouldn't you get the same effect? And so he proposed natural selection as an alternative to artificial selection, to intelligently driven selection. So the mechanism was meant to exclude a designer in the very way he formulated the theory. And so that's been the big issue: design or no design.
So there we're really taking a look at the very interesting discussion that's unfolding regarding the nature of the universe itself and life itself. So the question doesn't only surround the question of how did the moon and the earth get into their gravitational circuit together, right? Because the moon has a cycle that moves around the earth, and the earth has its cycle that it moves around the sun. And you can imagine that those have been dynamics that have been in place for a very long time. They're the gravitational dynamics of our solar system that affect all the planets in our solar system. We have to look at that and question how that got arranged, where those materials and how those laws of physics, like gravitation and the issue regarding trying to measure photons of light and trying to understand the atomic weight of elements and all these kind of concepts surrounding the inner mineral reality of the base background material and the stars that are burning that material within our universe. And then we get to Earth and we have to look at the interesting arrangement of water and the sudden green explosion of plant life in the ocean, in the rivers, and every field and stream all over the planet, and all the butterflies and all the worms that make up the soil, and all the horses and all the mammals and all the creatures that fill up the sea. We have to ask ourselves how such highly elaborate, complex, and sophisticated orders of life have come into being, and how those processes could exist. And evolutionists, these Darwinians, they want us to believe that salmon could try to swim upstream to find their actual original place of birth when they were an egg, so that they can either swim upstream to find that location, reproduce, or die in the process. That those kind of forces within our instincts, within our nature, within our species and our biological forms, our physiology, if you will, and even all these terms and all these sciences that we've just now in the last 100 years begun to develop to study these questions, that all these complexities of life and existence could have just arose into spontaneous existence ex nihilo, out of nothing, with no intelligent guidance whatsoever. And it takes us back to the question of the gene, the genetic material itself, the mechanics of the genetic material that are so closely wound. It goes far beyond a clock. I'm talking about an Apache super server, the kind that you would find in rows in the NSA as they try to make a record of all electronic data that happens in the world, practically. So you can imagine that a blind Apache supercomputer worker who can somehow put together by random chance a supercomputer. I mean, this is the kind of level of sophistication we're finding within the living cells. And let's go back to the conversation, and we'll look at that more. We'll look at as Eric Metaxas and Dr. Stephen Meyer go into this deeper discussion about the nature of the physical complexity, the sophistication of the organisms, and how Darwinian theory is helpless to try to explain how those orders of elaborate information systems could come into being.
Well, I guess what I find so fascinating by this, and one of the reasons I was so happy to get you to come here, is that it's ironic, I would say, at least ironic, that the scientific establishment today is as hidebound in a way, and as I said earlier, calcified in their ideology, that they're not even willing to be slightly open to the possibility that there might be an intelligent force. And so they have been tremendously dismissive, as I understand it, of the intelligent design movement. I mean, you've lived this. Why do you think that is?
Well, I have a friendly debating colleague who is a Darwinist, Michael Ruse, who says that he's written an important book in which he explains that Darwinism has functioned as something of a secular religion for many scientists. And many scientists, I think, have had a difficulty distinguishing what you might call materialistic philosophy from the enterprise of science itself. So if you have a theory that has non-materialistic implications, or which challenges a theory that does have decidedly materialistic implications, there's an implied threat to a deeper worldview or metaphysical understanding of reality. And I think all of us respond when our fundamental belief systems are challenged, sometimes with some passion and zeal.
So their objections are irrational and religious.
I wouldn't say they're irrational, but I think that the level of response is, or the passion of the response is understandable from this because of the big issues that are in play.
Are you naturally this kind, or do you just realize that you have to be diplomatic? I have to say, no, that it's the more I have looked at it, I've been staggered by the well, how do I put it? The lack of scientific rigor in that kind of thinking, or maybe just to say the lack
I can give you a number
logic.
of it. You know, some of the week my book was released. It was released on
this book.
This most recent one, June 18th, earlier this summer. By 3 o'clock in the morning, there were about a dozen of these one-star hostile reviews, and some of the turns of phrase were just choice. Mendacious intellectual pornography.
Right.
Steaming pile of pseudoscience. That kind of thing. So.
That's great.
By people who clearly had read the book very carefully, and the day after the book was released, there was a 9,400-word review on June 19th. Now, the book is 400 pages plus with notes, and so you can. This is struck a nerve, and there were people lying in wait. So,
well. I'd say that's a compliment. I think that the other thing that one hears, and also I have heard it, is that this is not science, and what these people seem to do, and again, you don't have to take a position on what you believe, but the idea that they're so closed-minded that they would simply say it's not science and are unwilling to discuss it. I guess I wonder what they think science is, because if logic and evidence leads you to surmise that, yes, perhaps there was intelligence behind this, that there's design, it's a logical and a scientific conclusion. So to say that you can conclude anything but that is just strange to me. And it seems to me that they have this idea that anything that kicks against, that shakes up this materialist ideology, really religion, is unacceptable. And so they say it's not science, and because most of these folks are part of the powerful scientific establishment, they can say that. So I guess I want to ask you, what is science to you?
Well, this is part of what I studied in my dissertation years in Cambridge. That it turns out that there's a lot of talk about the scientific method, but it turns out there are actually many different scientific methods. And I studied very intentionally, very consciously, the method that Darwin used in reconstructing the ancient past. Discussions of biological origins are, in the end, discussions of natural history. And there's a particular method of scientific reasoning that scientists use when they're trying to study events in the remote past. You can't make a trilobite re-emerge under controlled laboratory conditions. So the kind of science that bench physicists or chemists do in the laboratory is not going to be applicable to studying the ancient past. What Darwin did was pioneer essentially a method of forensic science, where the clues that are left behind are used to reconstruct what happened in the ancient past. And he had an important rule of reasoning, which was that if you're trying to explain an event in the past, you want to invoke causes which are, as his mentor Charles Lyell put it, now in operation. You want to invoke causes that are known to have the power to produce the effect in question. Now, I had become fascinated in the mid-'80s with this problem of the origin of biological information. It turns out that organisms are chock full of digital codes stored in the DNA molecule and other forms of information stored elsewhere. And there is a complex information processing system at work inside organisms that allows them to function and survive. So if you want to build a new cell, if you want to build life in the first place, or if you want to build an animal, you have to have the evolutionary process would have to produce a great deal of information. But that was the very question that was bringing a lot of evolutionary theories to a point of impasse. And so I began to think about this. What is the cause now in operation that produces digital code, that produces information? And I realized there's only one, and that cause is intelligence or mind. In other words, what we know from our uniform and repeated experience, the basis of all scientific reasoning, is that intelligence produces information, whether we find it in a hieroglyphic inscription or a paragraph in a book or a section of software code. Whenever we find information and trace it back to its source, we always come to a mind, not a material process. And so I realized that by using Darwin's own method of reasoning and his key principle of scientific reasoning, we could make a very rigorous scientific case for intelligent design. So when people say it's not science, I want to say, well why? It's based on scientific evidence, and we're using an established method of scientific reasoning, in fact, the very method that Darwin used. If the theory of intelligent design isn't scientific, by that same logic, then Darwinism would have to be excluded from that same designation.
I'm sorry, could you repeat that? You said you were fascinated by something in the mid-'80s. I remember that. And it's funny, in the mid-'80s, I was fascinated with the Eurythmics. I don't know if you've heard of them. In any case, well, before we get to your book now, I wanted to, actually, to be honest, I was not fascinated by the Eurythmics at all. Before we get to your book, I want to ask you about irreducible complexity. That's another one of these terms that gets thrown around. What you were just saying, essentially, is that the things that exist, these organisms that exist, are too complex, probably too complex, to simply have appeared. And it seems that something with that much complexity, that much information, and when you say information, you mean...
Well, digital code. Yeah. Watson and Crick, 1953. They elucidate the structure of the famous double helix, the DNA molecule. 4 years later, Crick proposes something called the sequence hypothesis, which was the recognition that there are four chemicals, they're called bases, that run along the spine of the DNA, that function like alphabetic characters in a written language or digital characters in a machine code. And since then, we've learned that information is directing the construction of mechanical parts.
That part of the recording gets a little bit fuzzy, but it's going to start to break down how the mechanics within each individual living cell within the tissue replaces individual parts within the cell, and how there's different mechanics and vehicles and different myriad proteins and a complexity of different compartments within cells producing different chemicals, doing all kinds of different, it's almost like a tiny city. And to have those cells be able to reproduce and have those cells be able to tell which cell is eye tissue, which cell is skin tissue, which cell is the liver tissue, and for these genetic materials to be able to constantly reproduce these cells within your body is absolutely mind-blowing biochemistry, and it also is completely unexplained by the Darwin or any of these evolutionary evolutionists who suggest that these systems could somehow just auto-evolve out of nothingness into these highly mind-boggling complex systems. So we're going to have to get into this discussion because it looks like that evolution theory begins to dissolve and to disintegrate and could no longer explain why biological life exists. In order to address this whole question, the prospect of there being really a Darwinian delusion that we've been under for the last, 80, 100 years, and I think in the future we'll look back at this era as kind of like a Stone Age era within our scientific understanding of biological systems. But in order to kind of like break that down some more, we have this discussion here. Again, it's Dr. Stephen Meyer and Dr. David Berlinski having an interesting chat, and we'll just listen in. I have to add that Dr. Michael Behe is also in on this discussion, and he's crucial to this discussion. And he actually was one of the original proponents of intelligent design. So, yeah, Dr. David Behe is also in on this discussion.
There's three different definitions of evolution, and the second one I think created a little bit of a stir when the idea that we don't have an issue with common descent or common ancestry. And explain that. That doesn't mean that you believe that all of us have come from all the kinds have come from a similar kind, or does it? I want to let you speak to that.
I have an issue with universal. I think they got me hooked up, David. But I have an issue with it. I know too much about fossils, for example. The major groups of organisms come suddenly into the rock record. The insects, the phyla in the Cambrian. I used to say to my students, you shall know them by their euphemisms. The Cambrian explosion, the marine Mesozoic revolution, the angiosperm big bloom, the mammalian radiation. I don't think there's good evidence for universal common ancestry. But the point I was making is that that's not what the theory of intelligent design is addressing. We're addressing a different question. We're addressing a more fundamental issue of whether there is or is not design in life and in the universe, and whether or not you can tell from the scientific evidence. So there's three facets of Darwinism: change over time, universal common ancestry, and the idea that a purely undirected mechanism produces the appearance of design. We're taking on that third, and we think most fundamental and important proposition. Once we get that one settled, the rest of the stuff will fall in place.
Mike, you want to jump in on that at all?
The reason we focus on just the point of intelligent design, or at least my reason, is that it's the easiest. It's the easiest. If you can remember to my talk, I showed the Far Side cartoon with the jungle trap. And you can ask yourself a whole lot of interesting questions that you'd like to know the answer to. Like, who made that trap? Maybe it was a native of the jungle. Maybe it was one of the explorers. And the guy who turned around and said, I wasn't in front. I didn't want to be in front. Or when was it made? Maybe it was made yesterday or a month ago. So you can ask a lot of who, what, when, where, how questions, and you need more information to answer those. But simply looking at the system right there in front of you, you look at that trap and immediately you know it was designed. Because the evidence for design is the system itself. The history of the system and so on is an interesting question, but you can tell that something was designed just by essentially looking at it. And so it's the easiest question to address. It's also the one that the evolutionists, the Darwinists, most want to avoid. They'd be happy to talk about any other question except how in the world could these complex machines and systems have come about without intelligence?
Because undirected natural cause is the foundation of Darwinian theory and science.
Absolutely.
So, Dr. Blinsky?
Well, if you'll permit me, I have a slightly different perspective on that question, but I think the question is essential. And just imagine you're walking in the desert. Right? And you're walking with a Darwinian biologist, and you come across a termite mound. Termite mounds are fairly complicated structures. They have many tunnels. They have elaborate construction. You say to the Darwinian biologist, how did that come about? And he says, well, the termites made it. Good answer. The termites did make it. The termites are perfectly capable of making termite mounds. You go a few miles further and you come across a nuclear fusion reactor. A massive thing sitting there in the desert, gleaming pipes, ducts, ceiling, waterworks, producing steam, generating electricity. And you turn to the Darwinian biologist and you say, here we are in the desert, there's a nuclear fusion reactor. How did that come about? And the guy says, well, termites made it.
you know that's not the right answer. You just know that's not the right answer. But the interesting case is one intermediate between these two. You're in the desert again, and you see something. That's all I'm going to tell you. You see something. And you turn to the Darwinian biologist and how did that appear? And the guy says it was the Darwinian process. What's wrong with that answer? Which is the answer that has been classically given by Darwinian biology. What's wrong with that answer is the description, I saw something, is not complete enough. It's not specific enough so that any answer is logically possible. In that sense, when Darwin proposed a mechanism for evolution in 1859, he was looking through the wrong end of the telescope. Because we had not, 150 years later, been able to specify the structures in the cell with that degree of sophistication and precision that would enable us to say, yes, that was a Darwinian process. Darwin was looking through the wrong end of the telescope. So are Darwinian biologists. The question that Darwin attempted to solve may be perhaps solved in 500 years. Now is not the time when it admits of a solution. We have not been able scientifically or rationally to describe the structures that we see, certainly not in molecular biology. The only honest thing that we can say is they're stupefying in their complexity. But if they're stupefying in their complexity, we cannot characterize that complexity. There is no theoretical model that is adequate to the task of explaining their emergence. That's a logical point. I think it's a powerful point.
And what you're saying is you don't need to be a scientist to grasp that. It is in your face. And in fact, all the mountain of words and theory does is obscure the obvious.
I think that's largely true. Anybody who's looked in the eyes of an infant knows that's true. No way to characterize the intelligence that one sees there.
Can I cue David up on another aspect of this common ancestry question? The poster child of transitional intermediate forms in Darwinian biology today is the transition from a hippopotamus-like land-dwelling creature to the modern whale. And David has asked some, I think, penetrating questions about the plausibility of that having to do with the anatomical changes that would be required. What could you say about that?
I've been thinking about this and remarking casually about this for about 20 years, ever since I first heard this incredible scenario that the whale, huge big thing, lives in the ocean, had its origins in some dim, dweebish, land-going, grass-munching creature. I said on the internet once it was probably a cow, and everybody, oh no, what do you know? It's not a cow at all, it's a moose. I don't care what you call it. The question is, what does it take to transform a land-dwelling creature into a sea-dwelling creature? Or, if you want an analogous question, what does it take to transform a 1976 Chevrolet Camaro into a submarine? It's the same question. It's the same question.
Or an ape to a man?
No, this question is more specified because we have a much better intuition about the changes. We know just what it would take to take a Camaro and make a submarine. A whole lot of work. But my question wasn't that this story was plausible or implausible. I have no interest in that question. My question was rather, do we have any quantitative measure of the number of changes? Just anatomical changes. After all, we take a cow or a moose, the first thing we got to do is make it waterproof. How do we go about making a mammal waterproof? Not a simple business. The skin is a complicated organism. How do we teach it to breathe 500 miles under the water? How far down do whales go? I'm in the ballpark, right? How do we get its blow spout or whatever those things use to the top of its head from the bottom of its head? How do we persuade this creature to give up eating grass and go munch whatever whales munch? Can we come up with a numerical estimate of the number of changes? And I said, I have no idea. These are very complicated questions in morphology and comparative anatomy. But I was able to say, well, back of the envelope, about 50,000. Say it's wrong. Say it's 5,000. 500,000. I don't know, but you don't know either. The point is, when you go to the paleontological textbooks, the question, how many fossils do we see that fit this pattern? And how many fossils might we expect rationally to fit this pattern? That question is never asked. Never asked. You go to the leading experts on caudate paleontology, James Carroll, a wonderful scientist. I looked through his textbook. Yeah, I understand there are all sorts of intermediates like Ambulocetus natans that have been discovered. And those are wonderful confirmations of Darwinian theory. There is an intermediate sequence, but there are only 7 of them. If there are 50,000 changes, what happened to the remaining 49,000 changes that should be in the fossil record? Can we explain that away? Is it plausible? It is plausible. My point is the question is not properly asked. It's a sign of intellectual flabbiness in Darwinian theory. One of many.
Okay, guys, we're going to end at 9:15. We're going to make ourselves more available. I want to say we're going to throw Ray to the lions. Here we've got this panel of 3, and then it's going to be Ray alone on Tuesday. So you're going to have all those text messages to chew through and get after it. But Ray is a very capable scientist and philosopher and able to do that with us. Now, here's the last 2 questions I want to ask. One, what is the best argument against intelligent design?
Look around.
Look around.
People, is that what you're saying?
World. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
Well,
Mike.
the argument from evil comes up quite a bit.
And one of the things that's not... Well, go ahead, Mike. We going to expound on that?
Yeah, why did my mother die? I've had people ask me that, and they say, you say that this was designed. My mother died of cancer last year. How could that be designed?
Yeah. How could an intelligent, especially a benevolent designer, as the Christian would represent, or the theologian, be any part of this design? So it's really a question of theodicy, more than it is a question of creation.
They're of a part, these questions. We find it very difficult to reconcile ourselves with the world as it is. There's no question that as human beings we do. Sin and suffering are overwhelming.
We were talking today.
Can I take a stab at that from about the rhetorical framing of that? That question is put to us, obviously raises a theological question. There's an artificial restraint on the debate that says that anything that has a theistic implication is not scientific. So people they think when they raise that question that there's a kind of a gotcha for anyone who's in favor of intelligent design. But I think to answer that, you have to bring in a theological perspective. And I think the Judeo-Christian biblical perspective is that you ought to expect 2 things in life, not one. You ought to expect evidence of design, but you ought to expect evidence of decay as well. There's something wrong with the world that wasn't intended, and if you're artificially prevented from giving a theological answer to what is in essence a theological question, then the ID perspective always looks deficient. But if we get rid of that artificial restraint and say we're going to follow the truth wherever we happen to find it, whatever disciplinary heading it falls under, whether that's science, philosophy, theology, I think there are reasonable, coherent perspectives on that.
There's an even better answer. It's an answer to the question, why is man's lot so miserable? Where wert thou when I created the universe?
Yeah. So you're saying the question that God himself asked to Job, where art thou? And so who is this that darkens counsel with words without knowledge?
Exactly. That will do as well as any other answer, right? I mean, there are questions we can't answer.
Yeah, it's interesting. One of the other famed neo-atheists today is, we've already mentioned him, is Hitchens, Christopher Hitchens. And I was recently in a room with Hitchens where he himself said, to your point, Steve, leaving the discussion about evidences for origins, if I was going to suggest there's a problem with your designer, it's the way that he lets this world drift to decay. But he said, I would agree that if the Christian story was proven to be true, it gives a compelling and acceptable explanation for the problem of evil, a congruent explanation of which I provide no other. But because I reject the Christian explanation, I therefore reject the whole thing out of hand. But he himself acknowledges if the theistic answer is true, it does answer the question that's presented to intelligent design.
Coherent. It's amazing some of the concessions that are granted on the ride home from the debate with these guys. I mean, I could tell you some interesting stories. So the difference between the podium presentation and what one of my students called the 4 o'clock in the morning questions, they have them too.
Yeah, it's true for every participant in the debate.
Yeah.
So the conversation is going to continue to kind of bring us closer to this interesting perspective, and we have to work hard to kind of like delineate the current academic dogma, the accepted absolute truth of their scientific conviction, the view, the picture that's painted in their minds of all the scientific evidence seems to suggest a very complex and sophisticated series of chemical interactions in a very vast, almost, if it was possible, infinite open void of space, time, and all the raw minerals and resources of the raw matter that's kind of just spinning around the galaxy, our solar system, and the planets and their moons, in the stars. And for this all this complexity and chemical sophistication, the neo-Darwinists see prospect of random, mindless coupling of these particles into useful systems that could create cellular structures. And then these cellular structures mindlessly have coagulated or gathered themselves together in proteins, in amino acids, and have created systematic processes that create larger structures out of these cells, like organs. And then these organs themselves have gathered mindlessly together without direction from any intelligent being to form living organisms. And then these living organisms have found within their own structure the genetic mechanisms and sophistication and complexity to replicate. Not only have these organisms developed from a cellular structure to become from cellular protein-based structures, they've gathered themselves up to create complex systems of organs, and then these organs have compiled themselves in the perfect alignment, perfect compilation, so that these organisms could be useful and could support higher functions, and so that organisms could develop nerve systems. And where do these nerve systems come from? We don't know. They just developed on their own without direction. And then not only that, but as these replicating systems with RNA and DNA are able to multiply, these organic systems were able to develop in so many different ways and replicate in so many different ways. And some of these replications succeeded and were able to carry on and then ultimately reproduce. I don't know who they would reproduce with, these successful organic structures, because you would need a mate like DNA, a like comparable creature to multiply with. But over time, they see this replication of cellular structures as the beginning root of all life. So worms, grass, moss, deers, birds, fungus, every living creature would have to have evolved out of these original cellular structures. So you can see that the problem is understanding how that could occur. And if, like the other speaker on the audio clip was discussing, these scientists, these neo-Darwinians, think that they'll eventually discover the processes and the systematic chemical abstractions that allowed for these mutations and allowed for these different life forms to occur. And then ultimately they'll figure it out later on, but that it must have occurred, because there can't be a designer, there can't be an intelligent guiding principle behind, living existence itself and living organisms. This must be a godless, mindless space, and it just must have occurred auto-naturally and just popped out of the soil and the moisture and the slime of Proterozoic ages gone by. And given enough time, we have owls and lizards, and we have all these creatures. So what we're going to see over the next decade or two, as we break into what Darwin called his black box, the microbiology of the living cell, the tiny structures, the tiny, complicated, super sophisticated chemical cities that live inside of each cell, we're going to discover that each living cell is so sophisticated and so complex that it couldn't possibly have evolved organically on its own. It couldn't just have arisen ex nihilo out of nothing. So we see the fingerprint of the designer within, we see the signature of the watchmaker within the watch. So we can see that these components are all so interlaced, interconnected, that you can't take a single component or organ or cell or a cellular process out of a living being without the living being being paralyzed or impaired or unable to continue to live. All these systems are so tightly knit and so integrated that they can't be removed. So that means they had to be built into place. So you can imagine it's even harder now for the neo-Darwinists to really come to an acceptable conclusion, because they couldn't imagine the designer when we were just dealing with physical, exoteric, if you will, or macrocosmic changes within living creatures. For instance, the ability of an owl to turn white in the winter and brown in the summer. His feathers change according to the season. So these are external adaptations within the actual biological physiology of the owl, but it doesn't take us anywhere near the submolecular, nearly invisible chemical processes that take place within an organic body. So as we start to examine that scientifically, we're going to see that these systems are so well placed and so well programmed, if you will, with information that it's impossible, even given an infinite amount of time, for a flower to just invent itself. Even if there were selection, even if there were some bugs that like that particular flower. Yeah, I mean, in order for a species to select, there has to be the prospect of a positive permutation within the genes for them to select. And in order for there to be a positive permutation within the genes, there has to be genetic mechanics at work. Tiny, invisible, sophisticated mechanisms that allow for one species to be the way it is. And if you have small adjustments within that species, this species was shorter, and that year there was a drought, and so that the shorter species could fit through between the tree line to get to the water, and so all the larger the larger animals died off, and so that you were left with just smaller species. Even with these tiny changes within microbiology, you can't ultimately get down to where you're writing and programming DNA. And where do you begin? Where does the DNA program begin with that? How do you begin to evolve genetic substances and genetic materials so that we can create whole new organisms? We're talking about building animals out of nothing but raw materials. And all these raw materials we can find in the universe. But the fact that they were knit together through genetic processes becomes the ultimate annihilation of neo-Darwinism. It begins to disintegrate right in your hands like so much sand. And people are going to hold on to this ideology, this religious perspective, because it suits them, because it's already worked into the global scheme of things, the United Nations and the New World Order, and those who it's very fitting for them to think that there's really a pyramid, and the most successful, the mightiest species are on top and all the lesser creatures are on the bottom, and it really justifies, like it said, like we were talking about earlier, in the discussion, the audio clip discussed how Hitler was a proponent of Darwin and thought that it was right that there really is only speciation, there's only natural selection, there really is nothing else whatsoever in life to be considered of. There's no creation, there's no creator, there's no need for creatures to be merciful to one another. This is just a matter of eliminating all the weak genetic material out of the human gene pool. And so that's what Darwinism left in its wake. It just left an empty, materialistic void. Immoral, amoralistic, secular power pigs found that doctrine to be very useful. So let's go on with this discussion and listen to another clip that we have. We're going to get a little bit deeper into the scientific debate. And it's no longer scientific to be a Darwinian. It's no longer scientific to think that the universe just evolved all plant forms and all reptiles and amphibians and marsupials and all life forms were just popped out of the furnace, out of the crucible of fire and ice, and the electricity as lightning was formed on the face of the earth. There was just nothing but primordial soup, and slowly, one after another, the amoebas crawled out, and those amoebas crawled up onto the beach, and they became animals, and they became elephants. That theory is so far gone, and is so completely eradicated, is so completely destroyed by science itself, that those who believe it are really exposing not their ignorance, but their religious devotion to a belief system that doesn't necessarily have any proof or evidence or any logic, but it suits their world order. They've grown used to their academic hubris and making fun of and just putting down those who don't hold their view or hold their dogma. So I think that on some level, those people in academia are just used to being scholastic fascists who get to make fun of other people, or to look down at other people who won't accept the party line and won't toe the party line of scientific ideology. So let's listen to this other clip here.
This really just goes to the power of propaganda and the ability for people to believe that what they really just want to believe. And once you inform within yourself and crystallize within the construct of your thinking and your kind of belief systems, the ideological framework from which you view the world and operate, and the lens through which you view the world, it's really hard to change this perspective and this crystallized perception within your thinking. So what we're doing is we're challenging that, and we have here Walter Vyeth. He's doing the clip, and he's going to discuss how improbable and impossible it is for life, even one single living cell, let alone hundreds of millions of, a billion living cells within your body, within all the animals and the plants of the world, the sheer impossibility of a single living cell coming into being on its own power without a creative force or without a plan or a design in mind. Let's just take a listen to Walter Weith's opinion on this.
The various molecules of life that had to form needed very different circumstances. For example, if you look at the amino acids, you have different amino acids, and each one of these amino acids has this NH2 group, this amino group over here. And this NH2 group had to, of course, be derived from this atmosphere, and it comes from the ammonia. But now, if you have ammonia in the atmosphere, then sugars don't form. So here is a big problem. Plus, you need a very acid environment in order for these to form, and then you would have to have only the right ones to form. And that would not happen, because when you pass these sparks through it, you get left-handed ones, you get right-handed ones, and you get all kinds of amino acids where the amino group is attached to any one of these carbons along the chain, and not necessarily to that first carbon next to this group over here, which is the carboxyl group. And so, if you have just one wrong amino acid somewhere in a chain, everything is non-functional. So here's a major problem, that you needed the right circumstances, plus you needed mechanisms of selecting just those amino acids which are useful to life. One wrong one in there and you would have a problem. Plus, even if you get the amino acids, how do you get them to come together and join together? You need enzymes for that. That means you need a protein to make a protein. So who was first, the protein or the protein that makes the protein? See, it's a bit of a problem. The next problem is, if you want to have the building blocks of our DNA, what our genes are formed of, then you need totally different circumstances. For these to form, you have to take all the nitrogen out of the atmosphere, change it into a cyanide solution, multiply that by 10, dissolve it in the ocean, and then you can get these molecules. But then you wouldn't get anything else. If you're going to make these sugars, again, as we spoke about earlier, that you need in the DNA molecule, for example, like the ribose, well, then you're not allowed to have ammonia. If you don't have ammonia, you don't have amino acids. So you would have to have many planets in order to create these things. No wonder science is saying it's not possible here, so maybe it happened in space. You have a theory there which is called panspermia. Now, this DNA molecule is another amazing story of life. Even if you get all the building blocks to form, how would you get it to form a string containing all the information that you need for life? How would you get it to do that? It has never ever been demonstrated in a laboratory. It needs a very complex enzyme system that will form these high energy bonds that are locked into this molecule. And the probability of these molecules forming is so remote so that we could say they are non-existent. So let's have a look at what the probability would be, for example, of a bomb exploding under a pile of wood, going boom, and then falling down from the sky and forming this perfect functional little house. What would the probability be? Well, the probability is very, very remote. Let's give it a very good probability, or a very poor one. In fact, it's even much worse than this. Let's say the probability is 1 in 10 to the power of 80. Now, what is that? That sounds like a very small figure. 10 to the power of 80 is what physics claims is the number of particles in the entire universe. Particles. That means not only atoms, but subparticles, electrons, hadrons, quarks, neutrons, protons, in the entire universe. How many atoms in a pinhead? Billions and billions and billions and billions and billions and billions, right? So imagine how many atoms in the entire universe. It sounds mind-boggling, but it's only 10 to the power of 80. It's not a very big number when you look at it, but that is really a mind-boggling number. 10 with 80 zeros behind it. So that would be the probability. What would be the probability of a simple gene coming into existence by chance? Well, there are 3 nucleotides needed to code for one amino acid in a protein. And let's take a simple protein that has 100 amino acids. Your hemoglobin, for example, has 600 amino acids. So let's take a simple protein, 100 amino acids. You need 300 nucleotides in the right sequence. What's the probability of that happening by chance? Well, the probability is 10 to the power of 127. That is, unfortunately, boom! New York City has been established by a nuclear explosion. Do you believe that? You would have to have that kind of faith. Now, if we look at this DNA molecule, it is a masterly construction. It consists of these double helixes forming the framework of phosphorus molecules, then the bases in between, and in the sequence in which they occur, these bases, you have the information for everything that happens in the cell. Now, these genes we call the genotype. And when these genes are expressed, we call that the phenotype. All right, let me explain these terms. It's very important that we understand how science pictures the evolutionary events around the genetic system. The genotype consists of all the genes actually present in a zygote. That's a fertilized egg. So all the genes that I have, that's my genotype. But not all the genes that I have are expressed. So that which is expressed is my phenotype. So if you want to have a look at your phenotype, go and stand in front of a mirror. And you'll see it. That's your phenotype. Now there's a law in evolution which states the following. Natural selection can only operate at the level of the phenotype, never the level of the genotype. You got that? Repeat it. Natural selection can only operate at the level of the phenotype, never the level of the genotype. Why not? Well, let me illustrate with an example. 2 people walk in wherever, in a game park. And let's say there are wild animals around in the game park. And the one person is long and lean, and the other person is short and plump. And now a predator comes from behind the bush and attacks them. A lion, a bear, whatever you would like it to be. And they both take off like greased lightning. Which one is probably going to end up being a meal? The short fat one, right? Okay. So short fat was the what? The phenotype. That's right. Short fat phenotype hasn't got a snowball's hope in hell against the lean mean phenotype. So by natural selection, short fat goes, long lean mean stays. Is that correct? That's how it works. The animal is not concerned with all the other information in your genes. It's just interested in how you look and how fast you run. Is that correct? That's it. So natural selection does not work at the level of the genotype. So what does work at the level of the genotype? How are genes changed over time? Not by natural selection, but by mutations. That's right. And how do mutations take place? They are random, they take place by chance, and once they are expressed in the phenotype, then they can be selected for. Does that make sense? Now remember, Charles Darwin didn't know anything about this. Only simple.
So we're just going to give it a pause right there, and you can see where Professor Walter Veith is going with this. If you want to hear more, you need to go do your own Walter Veith research and hear, some of the things he has to say. But the argument from here is going to graduate and to develop, and it's going to be devastating. So that you can see that at the genetic level, and the microcosmic level, when it comes to what we're learning about living cells and microbiology, that these systems are so incredibly, unspeakably complex and sophisticated and elaborate in their scale that there's no possible chance that these systems could have evolved. And when we start to look at the prospect of mutations being the possible selection process by which genetics and microcosmic living systems, so we're talking about the invisible to the naked eye biological construct of living cells, tissues, and enzymes and chemistry within our bodies, and that of the complete morphology of the entire animal kingdom being unique in every insect and every frog, that all those complex systems could have somehow evolved and auto-created their own phenomorphs into existence without some kind of guidance becomes such an absurd prospect, such an outrageously ridiculous proposition that it really collapses in this temple of sacred, ideological, academic, scientific sorcery that all these universities are built on, and it serves them right in all their pomposity and all their ridiculous arrogance by which they imagine a world that just grew grass and flowers and butterflies and mammals, and just these things just popped out of into existence out of the backdrop of the cosmos, and just somehow the cosmos itself just grew life forms like moss on this planet. It is just absurd. It's absurd to the highest order, and we're starting to unlearn these kind of ways of thinking. And these are the proponents of like Teilhard de Chardin, which we'll get into more later, and we'll discuss how he was involved with the Piltdown hoax, and we'll get more into how the United Nations is really reliant on these ideas of the evolution of natural species through selection, or just through a mindless, undirected force of the universe that just created everything. But it's not God, it's not Jehovah, it's not the God of the Bible. There was no, 7 epochs and seven eras of creation, or 7 periods of creation like the Bible describes. And so they're really rejecting this whole idea at the United Nations, and the globalists, and they're the same ones who are proponents of this idea of an endangered planet and the hysteria around we have to save the planet, we have only 12 years left to live before we can reverse the damage of the human virus on the planet, and all these ideas. They're getting towards depopulation and just total fascistic, autocratic control of the globe itself, and taking away what we originally protected, getting us back to the serfdom, the Middle Ages, the medieval period, when you were just a life form like a slug on the land, and the knights would ride through and do whatever they wanted. They would destroy the peasants or give them swords to fight, or they would you were just basically part of the property of the land. And that's kind of what we're getting back to as we start to lose our constitutionally protected rights and our liberties here in the United States. And we need to stand up for that. We need to recognize the dignity of life and the profound genius of the Constitution, and to push back on this kind of pseudoscience and this fake idea, these fake academic propositions, which really just are declarations of slavery. And they have no proof. They have no proof that the Cambrian explosion, that life forms can just explode into being. So you're going to go from plankton to brontosauruses and T-Rexes, and they can't figure out how that could happen. They have no basis to Darwin's theory is dissolving. So we need to kind of face up to that reality and recognize the deity and creative power of God. And that's the Almighty. That's Jehovah Jireh. That's the God of the Bible. And though Islam and the Luciferians behind Freemasonry and the Luciferians behind Mormonism and all these other weirdo groups seek to find a way to rationalize their insane ideology by just writing the role of God out out of our lives and out of the textbooks and out of the curriculum of our schools for our school children. We need to remember what the truth is and be unafraid to remind the world that life is a consequence of intelligent design. There's no other way to look at it. I'll leave you with this little interesting explanation from Dr. Michael Behe, and he's going to discuss the purposeful nature of design. And it's a very interesting philosophical and scientific breakdown of really what we're trying to get at by the phenomenology of life and how that spectrum of sophistication cannot possibly be something that could just, like we stated before, come into being without a cause. So let's listen to Dr. Behe here.
In Kansas, and the Times wanted somebody to explain what is design and what is the reasoning behind it for their readers. And so the point is that if you can explain it in an op-ed piece, it's not all that hard to grasp. So it's pretty straightforward. And the outline of my argument, I'm going to try to make 5 points today. The first point is going to be that design is not mystical. It's not something you have to close your eyes and raise your hands in order to grasp. Rather, it's deduced from the physical structure of a system. And the second point is that everyone agrees that aspects of biology appear to be designed. And when I say everyone, I mean even those people who most strongly oppose the conclusion that appearance of design is real, that it truly points towards design. And the people who disagree that the appearance is true usually have some other explanation that they think is correct. And the most popular one in academia anyway is Darwin's theory of evolution. That is, life developed by a series of random changes plus natural selection. And so my third point is going to be that there are problems with that idea. There are structural obstacles. In other words, there's physical reasons to think that Darwin's mechanism cannot do what its fans think it can do. But if you read, modern papers, magazines, look at TV, whenever you see a science show or a popular science magazine, you'll often come across the claim that science has already shown that Darwin's theory can account for life as we know it. It's been demonstrated already. And so my fourth point is going to be that those grand Darwinian claims rest on undisciplined imagination. Okay, not little Darwinian claims. It can explain a number of things pretty well, but the grand Darwinian claims that it explains the overall structure of life rest on imagination. And the fifth point then is going to be a summary point. It's going to be this, that right now, in the year 2014, we have in hand strong positive evidence for the purposeful design of life, and yet little to no evidence that Darwinism can do what's generally claimed for it. So let's start out, let's go through those points one by one. Start out with the first one, that design is not mystical. It's deduced from the physical structure of a system. And in order to do that, let's first ask ourselves, well, what do we mean by intelligent design? What is intelligent design? And if you look in a dictionary, you'll see a number of definitions, but the pertinent one is something like the following: that design is the purposeful or inventive arrangement of parts or details. And we can kind of shorten that, saying that design is simply the purposeful arrangement of parts. And that means that we deduce design, we infer that design has happened whenever we see parts that appear to have been arranged to accomplish a function. Well, that's a bunch of words. It's oftentimes easier to grasp an idea if you can see an example. So let's look at the next slide here. Don't know if you can see it too well, but this is a Far Side cartoon. And let me try to point with a cursor here. And we see a troop of jungle explorers here. And the lead explorer here has been strung up and skewered. And this fellow here turns to this guy here and says, "That's why I never walk in front." Okay, words to live by. Now let me assure you. Okay, whoops. So, let me go back. Everybody here looks at this cartoon and immediately realizes that this was designed. This was not an accident. His death was intended. As a matter of fact, the humor of the cartoon depends upon you recognizing the design. It wouldn't be all that funny if he just fell over a cliff. So let's ask, how do you know that? How do you know that this was designed? Is it a religious conclusion? Probably not. I haven't been to this church before, but probably not. No, you know that this was designed because you see a number of different parts. You see the wooden sticks, the vine, purposely arranged to fulfill a function. The purposeful arrangement of parts. So that's the point, that we deduce design from the physical properties, the physical arrangement of parts. But there's one other point that I have to make about detecting design before we move on, and that's the following: that the strength of the design inference is quantitative. And by that I just mean that the more and more parts we have, and the more and more closely they are arranged to fulfill the function, then the more and more and more confident we can be in our conclusion of design. Now let's look at an example of that. Suppose you and a friend were walking outside and you came across these mountains, and your friend said, "How do you think those mountains got there?" And you would say, "Gee, I never did take that geology class. Plate tectonics, volcanic activity, I don't know." Well, most people would say, "Oh, that sounds reasonable. There's no reason to think of anything else." But suppose you and your friend continued your walk a long way away, and you came to New Hampshire, and you saw this mountain, and your friend asked you that same question: "Where do you think this mountain came from?" And now you would say, "Look at that. This is actually a structure called the Old Man of the Mountain, and there are state workers on it trying to stabilize it. It was unstable. It actually fell down a few years ago." But you would say, like many tourists did, that, "Hey, you look at that, it looks like a face. There's a chin down at the bottom, and something that kind of looks like a nose in the middle, and a forehead towards the top. Do you think maybe some Paleolithic tribe might have gotten together and hey, maybe, but it's probably just some strange arrangement of rocks. You look at it from a different direction, it doesn't look anything like a face." Most people would agree. But then you and your friend continue your walk, and you come to this mountain. And he asks the same question: "Where do you think this mountain came from?" And now you'd never say plate tectonics or volcanic activity, at least for the faces here.
As we look at Mount Rushmore.
Even if you had never heard of Mount Rushmore before, anybody would conclude that these faces were purposely designed. They were put there by somebody who knew what he wanted to accomplish. And the reason we conclude that is because we see more and more parts that are arranged, shaped the right way, placed the right way to fulfill the function of conveying those images, the presidents of the United States. So that's the point, that design is not mystical. We see it from the physical evidence, the purposeful arrangement of parts, and that the more and more evidence we have, the stronger and stronger our conclusion of design can be. Now let's focus on the second point, that everyone agrees that aspects of biology appear to be designed. No, if you read Dawkins, it's not for aesthetic or other reasons. It's rather for engineering reasons. He writes a little further into the book that we may say that a living body or organ is well designed if it has attributes that an intelligent and knowledgeable engineer might have built into it in order to achieve some sensible purpose, such as flying, swimming, seeing. Any engineer can recognize an object that has been designed, even poorly designed, for a purpose, and he can usually work out what that purpose is just by looking at the structure of the object. Now, what's he saying? He's saying that we recognize design by the purposeful arrangement of parts. So even Richard Dawkins agrees that that is how we come to a conclusion of design.
So we're going to just leave the episode right there. I think we're going to come back and do a part 2 because there's so much more information we can do, and there's some more things we need to add. Like I said, I wanted to get into controversy with Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, who was a Jesuit Catholic priest and a paleontologist and geologist, and he took part in the discovery of the Peking man, and it was really became the Piltdown hoax, which they used the jaw of a boar and the skull of a monkey, and they tried to pretend like that found the missing link that in biology that would connect mankind to monkeys, and this happened in the 60s or the 70s, and they used this as the precursor. They had it in a museum, and it was the precursor kind of scientific evidence, and there was whole books written on it that then this was used as the foray into connecting human beings to other Earth biology in a matter of trying to create evidence for evolution theory. So it shows how committed they were in this scheme of globalism, and probably in their personal convictions too, that the Earth is just kind of on autopilot and the universe is just happening on its own, and that everything is just arising and self-ordering out of nothing, and that there's no designer. And then later, it was found that it was an obvious hoax. Later on, when real trained scientists came into the picture, it became clear that they had just put the pieces of other animals together to create this false evidence. So we're going to get into that more next time and talk more about how the delusion of Darwinian theory is really a disturbing neurosis on the thinking and the kind of the larger scope of human mass consciousness on the planet, and the way that we view ourselves as a populace and as a species on the planet. And I think that it's useful to them to move us towards this idea that somehow mankind is a pollution. We should all just function within our own animalistic urges and our will to power, and might makes right and the fittest to survive. And so you can have these guys like Bill Gates come out and try to sterilize populations of people in Africa, and even using some of these vaccines to kind of exterminate the population. They're getting towards this global population control and these mechanisms of the United Nations, because after all, these are just useless eaters, these are useless breeders, and they're really just taking up space on the planet. And we just need to cut them back the way you would use pesticides to kill the insects in your home. And this is the kind of thinking that arises out of this neo-Darwinism. And so it's important that we show you that it's dismantling, even as it's becoming the kind of the forefront of our thinking, and it's really a propaganda that's taken hold within our schools for the last 50 years and shaped these neo-Marxists thinking, and they created this godlessness and this atheistic idea within academia, and right as it's becoming a powerful force motivating, the world politics, and it's the underlying ideological framework that holds together this whole idea that these people that think that they're just going to live their life as their own God, their own deity, that they're the highest, intellect that they need to answer to. Right at that moment in time, since 2013, we're now seeing the collapse of the actual scientific evidence around Darwinism, so that we can see that speciation and even the organization of material particles and atomic structures on the chart of elements could not possibly come into existence without an original cause, and that original cause had to be someone outside the universe in a grand scope. And so we're seeing that the evidence of God coming into play right in this interesting moment into 2020. I think the academic community has no way to really deal with it. Look forward to you coming back again next time, and we'll address this in part 2.